Thanks to the organizers of this symposium for having me. This has already been interesting. Even the hallway conversations have been incredibly instructive, and I know this is a great group of people. So let me see if I can get this on its way. Yes, it works. So I'm going to talk about the exploding metropolis in some way, taking up some of the same terminology that we've heard in the opening plenary. People talk about an urban revolution in the 21st century, an urban century. Really, what I'm arguing, which is at the basis of this talk, and that is part of a larger research project that I'm the principal investigator of at York University for 7 years. We're now at the halfway point on global suburbanism. Robin Bloss and other people are involved in that process. So I have 15 minutes to talk about something very large. I'll try to do justice to that. In that larger project, we're basically arguing that under the condition of current trends in technology, capital accumulation, and land development and urban governance, the expected global urbanization revolution in the 21st century is necessarily and largely a suburban revolution. And when I say suburban, I don't want you to think of white picket fences in suburban subdivisions somewhere in the United States that you've seen on television. I want you to think of all these kinds of places that are very diverse. So this is Cape Town and Shanghai and Singapore and some Eastern European city that I visited. I think it's Brno. But it could be anywhere because there are 170 million of such peripheral housing units in the former Soviet Union. And they are still, in suburban locations, most of them. But it's also, of course, the classical case on the left-hand side here, about 5 kilometers north of my university, in suburban Toronto, the classical single-family home subdivision. I love this picture in particular because most of those pictures you usually see don't have snow in them. But Canada, of course, being a winter country, has lots of that. And the other picture right next to it is also in the suburbs of Toronto, which is the view out of my office window from the university, which is the in-between city. The suburban expands, but it has quite a different morphology than the one to the left. What we're talking about is this. This is a representation of the last 5 years of census data in Toronto. You can see all the big, bulky red parts that you can see at the periphery are where most of the growth is. So you see that's a dynamic process of suburban growth. And it's not only more growth that we see in Toronto and other places, it's also much more diverse growth. So on the left-hand side, you see the bluer areas that are in the periphery of Toronto are also those that are the most recent immigrants. And the same overlapping map here is that those areas with the largest purple parts on the right hand side show the minority status, visible minority status, as they say in Canada, that are non-white populations. So you see both more immigrants and more visible minorities are now living in suburbs than before. That I threw in because we had a conversation about this yesterday at dinner. This is also to make the point that when we say suburbanization, we don't think of places that are unconnected from the rest. So this is from a novel by a Montreal novelist who has a character who is a fishmonger, and he says the clientele of the Poissonnerie Chanahan at Montreal's Jean Talon market is by and large made up of suburbanites from La Vallée Rapide, Chambday or Duvernay. But one should not be fooled by the innocuous demeanor of these predators. According to some estimates, the bluefin tuna population in the Atlantic has declined by 87% since 1970, a rate that matches quite closely the expansion of the suburbs over the same period. It can thus be deduced, Milo the fishmonger concludes, that suburban development is very much in step with the movement of the tuna shoals, extended suburbanization. The suburban revolution it's necessary to stress the sub in suburban revolution because mostly urbanization in the literature and public discourse is imagined as a concentric expansion of centrality of space, functions, economies. But such a representation is constant in the contradictory processes that add up to globalization. So we always have those connected to this idea of globalization. In Lefebvre's urban revolution, which has been cited a lot already today, in the Chicago school with its historicity and centricity, but also in the LA school, which ostensibly challenged that idea, we also have the centricity and post-centricity, post-historicity paradigm, which still repeats the main dichotomies in that debate. So urbanization today presents itself mostly as global suburbanization. So what I'm trying to do in general is to resituate that debate in those that we've already heard a lot about today: planetary urbanization, ordinary cities, Jenny Robinson's, or the post-colonial critique of the Western view of urbanization processes, just to mention a few of those that are ongoing. The third point also is very important, that when we talk about the suburban revolution or something like a suburban paradigm, we're not doing this separately from the overall attempt by a lot of people now to create, as Andy Merrifield called it, a reloaded urban studies. And there are a number of people, Alex Chaffin is in the room here, Alan Walks at University of Toronto, and others who are beginning to think very differently about suburbanization as something that has to be thought about as the urbanization process, part of the urbanization process, and determining of that urbanization process overall. Now, I will argue in the little time that I have that the accelerating proliferation of urban society, which Lefebvre talked about, necessitates a new thinking about politics in quite new ways, methodologically, terminologically, conceptually. And that is because urban society, in the Lefebvrean sense, but also in other ways in which people commonly think about it, has conventionally been seen as having spread as an implosion-explosion, in an implosion-explosion dialectics from the center outward. And I'll explain why it's necessary, I think, to think about that in these terms. So Lefebvre, this is the quote that, one of the many quotes, but this is perhaps the central one in his book, where he makes reference to that, is he talks about the tremendous concentration of people, activities, wealth, goods, objects, instruments, means, and thought of urban reality, and the immense explosion, the projection of numerous disjunct fragments. Then he names peripheries, suburbs, vacation homes, satellite towns into space. Now, in more policy relevant terms and in historical terms, Bob Beauregard said that with suburbanization comes the necessity to think differently about urbanization. So this is a very concrete way to think about it. This is making Lefebvre concrete. But to go back to the conceptual between implosion and explosion. So on the left-hand side, we have all these things that have really been talked about a lot in urban studies recently: spectacularization, condification, waterfront development, gentrification, the creative city, and. And on the right-hand side, we've had a decade or even more of a debate on sprawl in the sustainability literature, a huge debate on regional governance, and all that. So these are real debates that are going on the implosion and explosion side. The problem is with the imagery, and that's really, it's significant to understand that Lefebvre writes this in the 1960s when the Americans put people on the moon. And so his idea is astrophysics, right? So this is the idea. If you live today, probably take an image from the biosciences or from computer sciences, right? And then you would have a much more different, a completely different understanding, a different metaphor perhaps of what it is that we need to think about when we think about this implosion-explosion thing. Because the problem with that is that you see a center, and from that center, something implodes, which means that the operative center, the place from where the causality comes from urbanization, remains in the center. It doesn't yet go to that extended, exploded part of the metropolis. From there is no causality to be expected. All the causality, it comes from the inside. So you have these two conceptual issues. what we are left with in the extended urbanization is disjunct fragments. Nobody has thought much about the causality that comes from these disjunct fragments. So the second point here is that the image suggests that the antithesis of the explosion is a consequence. So the explosion is a consequence of the implosion. It's not at the same level. It was this morning at Neil's talk, but in much of what people talk about is they talk as suburbanization as a consequence of urbanization and not as a process in its own right. And that is where we have to go to. So we're working on this manifesto of the suburban revolution. And there are these 3 points that I want to make, which is there are no essential differences between centers and suburbs. Suburban politics is not derivative of central or non-suburban politics. And the politics of everyday life becomes central to this idea of politics. So we're talking now not so much about the right of the city, but the right to the suburbs. And there are people working on that. So this is a reference to Rohan Quinby, who I can't give enough credit to right now because of time restrictions. But Quinby really argues that in capitalism nowadays, which suburbanizes the world, we are horizontalizing a whole bunch of relationships. And we're, and he uses Soja's term, the post-metropolis. He talks about a reconfiguration of the meaning of urbanism that is taking place. Centrality is increasingly reserved for immaterial networks. Stephen Graham's last mile in the inner cities of power are the physical assets that support them, down where the banks are, in the center of the global city. While the bodily experience, the actual existence of urban life within the post-metropolis is increasingly moved to the periphery. And that states the political problem in the city in completely different terms. Then this is just a nod again to a conversation we had yesterday about Ant and the assemblage. And what I want to point out is just one, Tom Bender's interpretation of actor network theory, where he talks about this being a theory heavy in gerunds. And I like that expression, because it's really about what I call the cities in waiting at the periphery that haven't really congealed yet into the sort of centrality that we normally associate with urban polities, but are beginning to develop political agendas and are now reflecting their agendas back onto the metropolitan region overall. So I can't go into this much, but I want to point out that what we're ending up with is not a dichotomy of urban politics in the classical way, urban regimes and so on, that takes place somewhere in the city, and in suburban politics on the other hand, but we're ending up with a large metropolitan or post-metropolitan field of post-suburban politics. That is based on a reconsolidation of the urban fabric, a balancing, a rebalancing of what it means to be urban, and that includes a rejection of the classical functional or conceptual dichotomies, such as live-work, where we can't, like in the case of the commuter sheds that we heard about, we cannot assume anymore that there's one place where we work and one place where we live. But there are a variety of different live-work experiences across the urban region that can be suburban or not, but in reality are now being governed by that horizontality that I was talking about. So in the classical sense, we have the politics are very clearly stratified in these particular ways. These are just two examples of two very influential political scientists, Paul Peterson and Clarence Stone, who've posed these questions about how do you distribute, how do you allocate across an urban region. And I would argue that you have to do this differently and rethink along different categories now what we're getting into. So in terms of space, we have a powerful realignment. In terms of class, where the gentrification of the core continues while the centrality of the in-between spaces that nobody is talking about while everybody talks about Florida's creative class downtown, that has to be now politicized along struggles around infrastructure, environmental justice, social justice, and so on. And society has to be rethought, urban society itself, that urban society that Beth's talking about. And the example that I've given you earlier was the hyperdiversity of immigrant suburbs in the Toronto region that haven't been yet understood theoretically, conceptually, as we continue to think about cities as, you know, dense places. And lastly, politics, the center, the periphery, and then these post-suburban constellations. So, what we've done very concretely in the group of people that I've been working with here, this is a paper that's coming out in Igor on real existing regionalism. Jean-Paul Addy and I have said that we need to look at 3 different areas: talk, territory, and technology. As the 3 areas, so this is discourse, is the new municipal areas in which are forming as polities, and the technologies, which goes back to this question of materiality and the extended metropolis, infrastructure, water, mobility infrastructure, and so on, through which we can actually assess how the extended metropolis is going to be governed in the future. And remember one more time, these are cities in waiting. These are cities that are still emerging. And most of the politics that we're concerned with in the political science literature on cities is about cities that are actually existing. And I think that is a mistake, and that needs to be rectified. Thank you very much.
I'm really pleased to be here, although obviously I'm sorry that it's under the personal circumstances of the programmed person not being able to be here. So my sympathies to Adelina Baptista for whatever it is that's befalled her. But I want to start today with the contention that the project of governance has failed. It's failed in the sense that the promise of democratisation and the flattening of expertise and power through participative networks have not delivered an alternative to the prevailing neoliberal hegemony. Now, this is an argument put forward by numerous proponents of the so-called third wave of governance. A first wave of governance involved the so-called hollowing out of the state, replaced by networks of stakeholders within multi-actor and multi-level configurations. A second wave emphasised actually the reassertion of the hold of the state through new forms of meta-governance, the so-called governance of governance. For Dean, this is an immensely seductive narrative of the shift from hoary old ideas of politics and territorial states to a cultural and network form of governance. Yet this is a seduction to be resisted. Indeed, for some, the discourses of governance have legitimised neoliberal hegemonies and bolstered existing interests. Instead, as social and political scientists, we need to re-engage with the political project of governing societies, and by extension, cities themselves. And I use the word governing deliberatively and consciously, because this refers to a process. There are several strands to this third wave of governance, the state neither being a single or a unitary actor with an irrefutable ontology. Rather, these theorists, such as Bever and Rhodes, emphasise not systemic past dependencies or what they call creeping forms of reification and formalism, but rather tradition and locked-in attitudes. So in their book, Bever and Rhodes reframe the state as a series of contingent and unstable cultural practices, which in turn consist of the political activity of specific human agents. There are 2 implications of this idea of the third wave of governance or governing that I would like to focus on. The first is that we need to study governing practices or regimes of practice. This implies a present continuous state, a present continuous rather than seeing governance as a fixed point or end state or actual description of the way things are. A shift from institutions to meanings in action, or from social logics to narratives. Furthermore, this requires some recognition that governing practices in one domain, such as, for instance, climate change policy, may differ from those in another, such as cultural policy. And here we have an example from an alternative approach to developing city regional climate change policy in Greater Manchester. These quotes from one of the key protagonists of developing this stakeholder strategy, focusing explicitly on the role as narrative, as an opposition here to evidence, and what they call anti-governance. This governing practices approach is not, however, power blind. Many of these accounts draw on Foucauldian notions of governmentality and see power not just as about domination, but as reciprocal, unstable, and reversible. So practices can therefore be bundled to produce structural-like effects. They can exhibit patterns over time, and through their repetition produce similar kinds of outcomes. The second implication relates to the normative side of third wave governance studies. critical urban scholars, amongst them Brenner, who we heard from this morning, have been calling for greater engagement in the processes of urban change in an active project for re-governing societies. Governing, as a present continuous practice, I would therefore argue, offers what Amin and Thrift say is a politics of hope, seeing not the obduracy of existing institutions, enduring, fixed and oppressive, but the possibility that individuals can change systems. The example here I've pulled on is an emblematic food laboratory in the city of Greater Manchester. This is the Biospheric Foundation. It's actually just round the corner in East Salford from where Engels wrote some of his tracts on Manchester. And this is framed as a part farm, part laboratory, part research centre. And underpinning it is a very strong narrative around the way in which exceptional maverick-type individuals have been able to, or are seeking to, change the system. And interestingly, the example of food here is very resonant with this implosion-explosion dichotomy, because of course food inherently implies a different relationship between the urban and the rural in the rebounding of new systems of production and consumption. In the language of transition theorists, we can characterise this as being about new niches of practice which have the possibility to change regimes and potentially landscapes. So rather than seeing lock-in and path dependency, scholars in this vein have started talking about resistance, or Purcell's networks of equivalence, or spaces of discretion. Local actors can draw on alternative traditions and narratives to resist policies, according to Bever and Rhodes, whilst others see that neoliberalisation is actually riven with cracks which can be exploited by new coalitions of democratic movements. Now, these debates are particularly resonant at the level of the city. In part, this is due to many of the debates we've already discussed around the attempts to both fix and unsettle the ontology and epistemology of the city, characterised as an actor, a site, a set of relationships, an assemblage, a machine, a space for everyday practices. Yet it's also resonant because critical urban studies calls for this normative orientation to the city, perhaps most currently vocalised in the reframing of Lefebvre's right to the city. So here the city is often characterised as a linchpin for networks of equivalence to come together, following David Harvey, a space of hope or a set of potentials. And it's here, I think, that we need to start examining the role of the university itself as a site of knowledge production and a potential linchpin, to borrow that terminology, in its own right. Whilst Lefebvre often sees change as coming from the proletariat, a number of these scholars have argued that that's not going to happen. What then is the role of the critical urban scholar? Importantly, this isn't about a separation between theory and practice or knowledge and action. So drawing on Brenner, Marcuse and Mayer's 2012 call in Cities for People, Not Profit, a critical urban studies is seen to have four characteristics. It insists on theory and practice, sees knowledge of urban questions as being mediated through power relations, rejects instrumentalist, technocratic and market-driven forms of urban analysis, and is concerned to excavate what they call the possibilities for alternative, radically emancipatory forms of urbanism that are latent, yet systematically suppressed. To this we would add, from Tim May's and my own work on social research and reflexivity, the importance of reflexivity in thinking through the transformative potential of knowledge and the challenges of critical and engaged urban practice. So whilst universities are obviously not neutral spaces, and indeed are often complicit in the project of building neoliberal knowledge cities, as Steve said this morning, Tim and I have argued that they do remain spaces of possibility for the constitution of alternative urban futures. And I think we can ask what public institutions other than the university are left in which critique, contestation and challenge remain possible against what Mitchell Dean calls the two G-spots of neoliberalism, globalisation and governance. So building on these intellectual debates, I would argue that we need a new project for governing cities, a project that's not only about studying existing, emerging and alternative governing practices, but that's actively seeking to transform them. And of course that's easier said than done. Funding schemes tend to be antithetical to explicitly political projects and emphasise impact, innovation, university, industry, government relations. Yet there is some space for manoeuvre, and we found this space of manoeuvre in two existing projects. The first's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, their Connected Communities programme. And the second is funded by a Swedish environmental research agency called Mistra. Mistra have funded a series of what they call local interaction platforms in cities across the world to bring together different stakeholders, academics, practitioners, and we would insert the civic society as well, in the creation of more innovative urban futures. Okay, so just briefly, I've got 5 minutes left. How then have I sought to marry the study and transformation of governing practices within these projects in our context of Greater Manchester? First, both projects in different ways are grounded in the acknowledgement that existing governance structures have not worked to deliver what Brenner calls radically democratic, socially just and sustainable forms of urbanism. So here you can see Media City, on the other side an alligating project just round the corner in Salford around the time of the Jubilee. And Paul Chatterton asks, will the real creative city please stand up? Whilst others talk of the debates around urban creativity as being characteristic of cauldrons of neoliberal gangs. The same arguments can be made in the area of sustainability and climate change in terms of the capture of an environmental agenda by market forces and economic imperatives. So what's being drawn attention to here through thinking about governing practices are the ways, informally and formally, in which ways of governing are being developed. And within this, we can see some of these spaces of resistance. I haven't got a huge amount of time, so very briefly, in relation to the work on challenging the creative economy discourse, we've started talking about a bundle of practices called cultural intermediation. And this refers to different ways of brokering, networking, connecting between communities and sets of values, pushing back against some of the discourses that have come through. Similarly, in relation to our work on environmental sustainability, we can see, through focusing on the governing practices and the narratives and traditions that people are evoking, alternative possibilities, such as steady-state economics, circular economy, or the sharing city. So I would argue that the exposition of this critique is important, but the doing of critical urban governance research also involves the project of active transformation. And for us, we framed this, we had 3 T's as an alliterative toolkit just now from Roger Keil. I'm giving you 3 V's: in visibility, voice and values. And these are 3 steps for us in which we're trying to move from a critical urban theory to a more radical urban practice. Visibility, this means raising the visibility of different alternatives which have economic, social and ecological benefits, which might be context sensitive, open and participatory. We're looking at building spaces, infrastructures, community arts projects, different forms of community activism. That's visibility. So in terms of voice, this is about creating platforms in which some of those alternatives can be more visible. That might be virtual, it might be through bringing people together in different ways, it might be through co-producing projects. So one of our projects is with the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisations, where we're looking at how you could realise the benefit of community assets. And I would elaborate to say, of course, voice doesn't equate to any form of power, so I was going to say something about voice and antagonism, which I think is really important. So this isn't about generating consensus, but about revealing difference, or, as I would put it, turning up the volume on the possibility for change. The final step is to talk about values. The relationship between knowledge and action is not cyclical, of course, and some of the missing points on that it's not linear. So some of the missing points on the cycle are learning and values, and we don't talk enough about those. So following some of the transitions theory, I think there's a role for platforms, such as the ones we're trying to create, to get engaged in the upscaling, replication, transferability, diffusion of new and emerging practices that challenge some of this work. I mentioned co-production earlier. I think there are challenges within this to how we actually go about doing our research. It's not about mapping governance structures or producing wiring diagrams, but finding new ways of engaging with different research methodologies. So in the Arts and Humanities Research Council project, for instance, we're doing some diary keeping with policymakers weekly and daily in order to get them to reflect on their practices. And in the Mr. Urban Futures platform, we're focusing on co-production. But of course, this is the equation that I want to emphasise. Co-production without critique is equal to co-option. I don't have time to elaborate now, but it's really important that to maintain a critical research project that may be transformative, periods of togetherness and apartness are built into co-produced processes, and which recognise the legitimacy of different forms of expertise. So this is a long-term project. It's been shaped within particular funding streams, but of course there's a long history of work in our centre at Salford University. I see it as an orientation to research rather than a particular project that can be delivered. And it requires a modesty in terms of the constraints upon us in the contexts and conditions of knowledge production in which we work. So I've argued that I think we need to deconstruct and reconstruct the project of governing cities. It's a modestly transformative agenda, modest in the sense that the conditions of knowledge production often militate against a long-term project such as this. Yet it's transformative in the sense that it seeks to transform and challenge governing practices and the practices of research, underpinned by a commitment to more sustainable urban futures.
First and foremost, I would like to say that being here with you today is a big pleasure for me. And I joined the Future of Cities program in February 2012. And before starting my presentation, I would like to thank the co-directors, Michael Keith and Steve Rayner, my colleagues Michele, Ebro and Idalina at Compass Ben, and also special thanks to Javier Lezón, Deputy Director at INSIS, and to Fredrik Björk from the University of Malmö in Sweden. Let's start with two statements. According to Alan Scott in 2001, there were more than 300 city regions around the world with the populations greater than 1 million. But in contrast, he pointed out the idea that city region is a geography that arouses confusion. Therefore, what does the term city region mean? Are all the city regions similar? How can we understand the concept of city region? In my PhD, I connected 3 city region cases: the Basque in Spain and France, Portland in Oregon, and Dublin in Ireland. Now, in my postdoctoral research period, I have included another one, Öresund, between Sweden and Denmark. Today, I will present my postdoctoral work-in-progress research project called The Future of City Regions Comparative Territorial Benchmarking, where I have connected 2 EU cross-border city region comparative case studies, the Basque and the Öresund. And as Jennifer Robinson argued, connection and travel beyond the local are the long-standing and constitutive of local cultures all over the world, an important consideration to any urban scholar. The presentation consists on 4 parts. Firstly, the 2 research questions. Secondly, I will explain the way that I have proceeded methodologically in comparing the 2 case studies using action research connection fieldwork since February 2012 and before. Thirdly, I will address the 3 research aims. The first one, the conceptual aim, deconstructing the city region. The second one, the analytical one, proposing a systemic analytical framework that I call the City Region 5-System Framework to identify territorial development strategies. And the third one, the empirical aim, applying this framework to the 2 cases. Finally, we'll end with the main conclusion. Kevin Morgan argues it is an ecological fallacy to suppose that what is true of some city regions is true of all city regions. The recent natural consequences of the crisis have led us to debate about the relevancy of the city region concept. And as John Harrison has recently pointed out, city regions are being actively constructed, where they are being mobilized in support of or in opposition to particular territorial development strategies. In my opinion, these strategies can be designed in one direction or another, having direct effects on the physical infrastructure set and the resilient distribution of the scarce material resources among citizens. I mean, urban system and urbs. Having direct effects on the level of usage of these resources to satisfy the physical, digital, and social connectivity of the citizens, cyber and relational system. Having direct effects on the active consideration of the diverse and complex civilian fabric and their mechanisms to regenerate transition-based regional political economy, civitas, and socio-cultural system. And having direct effects on the role of the politics in its global and local scales when it refers to stakeholders' complex participative interaction to reframe the governance model, police, and the socio-political system. To sum up, strategies that affect the demos, the democratic system of the city region as a whole. However, the current debate about city regions should not forget that what is demanded are new territorial development strategies capable of arresting economic decline and providing new measures in support of economic development, and at the same time to manage territorial inequality and to respond to concerns over democratic legitimacy of existing decision-making structures and public policy interventions. Therefore, my main hypothesis is that there is not a single model of city region. And I suggest that we can analyze systemically different city regions' models of applications or self-emerged processes according to their explicit or implicit implemented diverse territorial development strategy and ideologies in a specific socio-economic context. So I suggest looking through the lenses of the City Region 5 system framework to do so. Hence, the two research questions are, the first one, can we deconstruct systemically territorial development strategies under the so-called city region concept, understood as a complex networked territorial entity that can be actively constructed or passively perceived? I call it the future of city regions understood as a framework. And the second research question is, can we do it empirically, comparing, connecting diverse city region cases in parallel? I call it comparative territorial benchmarking understood as a methodology. Likewise, I would like to introduce the three main techniques of the action research triangulation methodology that I have carried out in my fieldwork connecting the two cases in parallel since 2010. The first one, direct participation, directing a congress, a workshop, and lecturing. Second one, ethnography, conducting interviews and group dynamics with agents in the social innovation field in both places. And the third one, reviewing the state of the art. Here are some pictures and links to illustrate the fieldwork that I have been involved in. On the one hand, this is the geographical sum of the three main separate administrative entities in between two nation states, Spain and France, that we can define as the Basque City region. Generally speaking, it's perceived as a city region with a complex diversity. On the other hand, here is the geographical sum of the consequences of building the Öresund Bridge in 2000 between Sweden and Denmark, that we can define as the Öresund City region. In contrast, Öresund City region is perceived as a city region with a pragmatic simplicity. I have been comparing some data organized by systems, and I can highlight that the Öresund City region presents higher cross-border territorial synergies than the Basque one. So briefly, let me remind you of the three research aims. In the conceptual one, I am deconstructing the city-region concept capturing the way some key authors refer to it, this table is just a summary organizing keywords by systems. In the analytical one, as I did before, I suggest the city-region 5 system framework that consists of 12 factors. In the last 4 minutes, addressing the empirical aim, I will present the main general findings of the work-in-progress Basque and Oresun cases applying the 5 system framework. Basque urbs. The capital city's polycentrism has been mainly based on the agglomeration city-region strategy, with a clear lack of integration with the valley-driven rural hinterland economics. Oresun urbs, as a Copenhagen-Malmo-centric, artificially designed economic and logistics city-region bridging pole. Basque cyber, social disconnectivity due to the problematic mountainous urban morphology and the ultra-localist idiosyncratic archipelago-shaped pattern. Oresun cyber, the bridge, has been the engine, icon, and the brand of the city region, enabling physical connectivity to turn into social connectivity. Basque civitas, strategic and economic elites, priorities, nano-biosciences, and advanced manufacturing should be linked with the civil society's social innovation grassroots, local business perceptions and behaviors. Oresun civitas, rigid and bureaucratic normative system, finding difficulties in activating the civil society. It requires a transition into social innovation policies from triple to penta-helix angle. 3 challenges ahead with the Basque police: to correct the multi-level government system overlaps, to reform institutional thickness that provokes cannibalism, and to encourage stakeholders' engagement in the policy-making processes. Oresun police, we can summarize it with an interviewee quotation in Malmo. I am a prime example of the difficulty of integration. I have social security numbers in 2 nation states. There are opaque pension conditions, and there are lots of hindrances when, for example, I need a new car. And finally, the Basque demos. Does the Basque city region exist? Finally, we got the peace, but territorially speaking, we are still 3 non-collaborative administrative cross-border geographies. And about the Oresun demos, does the Oresun city region exist? Well, so far it was such a fantastic social construction, but now it's stopped. So my main conclusion is that even though both Oresun and the Basque city region are actively constructed with different intensities and stakeholder composition and dynamics, they are also perceived as having objective similarities and subjective differences in the respective territorial strategies. To sum up, I can argue that while in Oresun city region, the territorial development strategies, driver system is cyber, and the laggard system is police, by contrast, in the Basque city region, just the opposite occurs. Both cases are contrarily complementary. I will keep on researching other city region comparative case studies in cityregions.org. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm going to try and bring a bit of a protest flavor to the theoretical debates, because like I was introduced, I'm coming from a civil society organization, a citizen-owned cooperative in Berlin that we established in 2011 to buy back our local low-voltage power grid. So yeah, I'm just going to take you briefly into what we're trying to do in Berlin and add a little more local view to the discussion. So what we're trying to do is really sort of a reproduction of what has been done in the early 1990s in a very small town in southern rural Germany, where the first group to really politicize this issue of low voltage grid operation was a local parents' initiative protesting against nuclear power after their Chernobyl incident. And their campaign was Ich bin ein Störfall, which is, Störfall is the German expression for a nuclear incident. And what they proposed really was to say citizens should be the incident that is disarming this this discourse that was very strong in Germany at the time, that nuclear power was a safe and sustainable alternative to fossil fuels. And so what they did was, back in the early 1990s, take over their local low voltage power grid in a citizens cooperative, because in a time where the market wasn't liberalized, that was essentially the only way to control the type of energy that they had. So to be free of nuclear energy, they really literally had to buy the grid. And although we have market liberalization in Germany right now, this call that they made to say, we need a decentralized structure, we need citizens to be empowered in these decision-making structures and to be liberalized in their choices of energy, it remains very valid today, and I'm going to go into the details of why that's the case. So why the local power grid? That's what people keep asking us. It's really not a very, very sexy or interesting issue to a lot of people. And, but we really think that controlling or deciding over the local power grid is a means of essential control over local infrastructure. And if we look at Germany in general, not just Berlin, the Energiewende, so this idea of shifting the energy system to renewables, is decentralized. And that's really interesting. The absolute lion's share of renewable energy generation is in the hands of citizens, and they're investing billions of euros in private capital in this project. And this application of a decentralized logic to the generation process really hasn't taken hold at all in a decentralized control of the local power grid, and that's something which we think is really important to address. And also, what we still don't have, even though we have market liberalization, even though regional monopolies have been broken up a little, we also still do not have a strengthened citizens' voice in these types of decisions. It's still very much the four major power companies of Germany that are controlling the general framework for decision making in terms of power grids, and there's very little space for citizen voice. And the third reason was that local power grids are a very safe and reliable asset. You don't make a lot of money, but you make a very steady amount of money. And that's why so many companies, quite frankly, are so interested in holding them, and that's why the four major energy utilities of Germany are keeping such a firm hold on them, because you make very safe revenues, and we think that's something, and this idea of local value creation, that should be taken up into discussions of empowering citizens in their cities. They should also have a way not just of participating in decision making, but also of participating in terms of the economic and local value creation structures. So essentially what we are trying to do is, like I said, to turn a small town success in rural southern Germany, where a lot of their success relied on the local doctor walking from door to door and saying, this really is a good idea, you can trust me, into a takeover essentially of the capital city, which has a few more people living there, and it's just a little more anonymous than this little small town. And why are we doing this? The window of opportunity that is opening right now is that the concessionary contract is expiring by the end of 2014. So the way that local low voltage grid operation is organized in Germany is that you have concessions that are awarded by the communal authorities for a period of 15 to 20 years. So in Berlin right now, and that's something which is happening throughout Germany, because like I said, liberalization was in the 90s. So 15 to 20 years later, now lots of communities are facing this first juncture where we have this opportunity to change things, and we're not going to have it again for the next 15 to 20 years. So that's why we set out in 2011 and started talking to people in the city, and what we learned was that there was very little interest in terms of the political authority in changing things. The current grid operator, it's Vattenfall, it's a Swedish state-owned company, it's one of the four major energy utilities in Germany, was really set to just be the next concessionary. Again, there was very little public debate in the city at all. When you talk to people, they were like, grid operations, what is that? Does that control the energy that comes out of my home? And we're like, no, it's a little more difficult. Okay, I don't want to know. there was very, very little interest and very little debate. And that was the reason why we said, okay, we need to establish this cooperative and enter the application process for the concession, not just to kickstart this public debate, but also to provide a real alternative in terms of having a citizen-owned company that would take over grid operations in the city. And like I said, we had these 3 key goals in saying we wanted to give voice to citizens in decision-making processes over the local power grid. We wanted to enable a direct financial contribution of citizens and also a direct participation in local value creation. And we wanted to support this shift to decentralized control that's happening in the generating sector of renewables and extend that to the distribution sector of energy. And we also believe that if we manage to do this in Berlin, that's going to be a really strong sign in favor of a decentralized and sustainable energy system, which goes far beyond just the city or even the country. We have lots of visitors by now. The more visible we get from all over Europe. We have our first cooperative members from Japan. Lots of interest from the US and all over the place saying if we manage to do this in Berlin, that's going to be a very strong sign in favor of this shift. So maybe a little more detail onto how or why we really need to control these distribution lifelines of the city, as we call them. Like I said, it's a very important issue to look at the local power grid when you look at renewable energies, because it's no longer this centralized structure of the local low voltage power grid being the last mile essentially between the large power supplying factory and the small household, but it's small generation all over the place that directly goes into the distribution grid. So it's a technical reconstruction of the grid that we need here. And it's also, because it's a regional monopoly, it's regulated by the federal authorities, and they also regulate the amount of revenue that you make, and it's a very stable asset. And we think this is something that really needs to go beyond this dichotomy of public versus private that was very, very strong in Germany, where we had this shift away from public towards private with the liberalization in the 1990s. And currently we're seeing this renaissance, essentially, of communal management, where a lot of communities are realizing this window of opportunity that is opening, and are also realizing that maybe this idea of selling the local power grids was not such a good one back in the 1990s because of the power that you have in terms of shaping the Energiewende on a local level, and also because of the money that you can make with it. And so we're seeing a lot of communities who are pushing for a public communal control, but we think what we really need is this sort of reconstruction of this idea, saying why don't we have a new form of public-private partnerships, essentially by saying we can be a private partner as a cooperative, as a company, but be public in a sense that we are owned by citizens, and we can be a partner to public authorities that are interested in communal control. So, and we think a cooperative is such a good instrument to do this because the way that it structures, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this type of company, but in Germany it has a very long tradition to have cooperatives. We have them in the banking sector, we have them in the housing sector. Cooperatives are really dominant also in terms of renewable energy generation and the citizen projects that I mentioned earlier. So it's a pretty well-known concept, but like I said, it's typically a small town success because it relies on pretty close ties between the members and a strong identification with the company aims, and that's something which obviously is going to be a challenge on the level of a city like Berlin. And of course also the success of the cooperative depends essentially on its political impact. And like I said, in 2011 there was essentially no public debate, so one of the main tasks for us was to kickstart this debate at all and to really persuade the local authorities that this was something that was relevant to the citizens of the city, and that this cooperative is now a player to be respected. Oops. And so that's something where we see our role in not just being an alternative in this in this application process, but also in providing information to the citizens on the role of the energy grid for the Energiewende, on their voice and the potential that they can have in shaping these decisions. And so what we do is mobilize a lot of local information events. We hold conferences for just citizens and ordinary people, where we invite experts on grid operation, experts from the political sphere, but also the economic sphere, and create a new type of forum in the city for information on why controlling the local power grid may be important. And it's also a challenge to us internally, like I said, to sort of inflate this cooperative structure to the capital. And a really important issue for us has been to sort of preserve and reinvigorate these internal qualities that a cooperative has of participation, of identification and transparency, and to hold that and preserve that and extend it to a level of where we have 2,000 members at the moment, and we need a lot more to grow to the level that we need to have to be large enough to take over this the grid by the end of 2014. So the next steps, sort of just to sketch out briefly that you can imagine what the timeline is. Like I said, we need to have a new concessionary as of January 1st, 2015. And between 2011 and now, we have managed to put considerable pressure on Vattenfall between us and another initiative, the Berlin Energietisch, that is pushing for a referendum, which is going to be held on the 3rd of November, and which is going to be a sort of an indicator of the way the city is going to go in terms of controlling the local power grid. We have 3 competitors aside from us. It's the Berlin Energie, which is a communal company that was established by the authorities, but is currently a little more than a letterbox. So we're going to have to see how powerful this competitor is going to be. We have the TÜGA, which is a German, well-established German energy utility, and we have Alianda, which is a Dutch, quite progressive, communally owned grid operator. And at the moment, we're in the 2nd stage of the application process, so we managed to not be kicked out in the 1st stage, which already we thought was quite an achievement, because we had to prove that we were not obviously incapable technically and financially of handling what we were trying to handle. But now we are going to have to go a lot further than that in proving that we actually can do what we want to do. So essentially, what we're proposing is a reconstruction in 3 ways. The first one, like I said earlier, is a technical reconstruction, reshaping the local distribution grid in terms of the challenges that it has to face with small decentralized power generation and fluctuating energy generation. An economic restructuring in terms of redirecting private capital flows for them to follow societal interests. So getting private investors to invest in a local infrastructure and strengthening the participation of citizens in terms of local value creation. And it's a social reconstruction in that we say this really influences the type of decision-making processes that we have on a local infrastructure level, and has the potential to influence decision-making in the energy system far beyond that because of the size, the sheer size of the capital city. And I'm going to leave it at that. Like I said, you're all very welcome to reconstruct our infrastructure with us. And thanks for listening.
The discussant for the 4 papers that you've just heard is David Howard from the Department of Continuing Education here at the University of Oxford. He's also a member of the steering committee for the programme, and he directs the Masters of Sustainable Urban Development here at the university. So David has generously agreed to confine his remarks for 10 minutes to ensure that we get the quarter of an hour Q&A at the end of the session.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Steve. I got my week's exercise just then, so thanks for inviting me. I'm very grateful for the organisers and also for the 4 speakers for just providing snapshots of what seems to be very interesting and stimulating research, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and I've made the assumption that you're either desperate to go to lunch or you're desperate to ask a question, so I'm going to be brief. Across the 4 papers, I was really struck about the rigour of the methodology but also empiricism. So we've been to Basque Country, we've been to Berlin, we've been to Manchester and Toronto, and that really sort of struck through, that mesh between the empirical, the methodological and the theoretical. I was also struck by the notion of difference, and I think there will be, for these 2 days, the next 20 years, that rumbling debate about urban process of difference, are cities extraordinary, ordinary, etc. And I think these 4 papers also address the notion of difference in terms of the territory, but also the process of urbanisation. And I think, for example, in Arwen's example, cooperatives need consensus, similarity, but I guess that the Berlin example is going to give a patchwork of quite differentiated communities with differential access to electricity. So I thought that notion of difference is there rumbling along. And I think in the rush of the morning, we've been moving around, but we've also had a notion of change transition. Most of the papers have looked like that the process of urban is always moving. And that clearly is probably the case. We're all mobile individuals in moving cities. But the notion of flexibility, arguably can go back to the classic notion of a bridge. A bridge works because when animals, cars, people's weather goes across it, it goes back to that original point. So as implicit in flexibility is stasis. And I just, that's one of the things I was just thinking through in this flurry of papers really, and movement as a focus. So we had the centrifugal notions of the city sort of lurking there as well in terms of suburbanisation. And also the waves of governance. In Beth's paper there was a clear notion of transition and change. So I I guess in Colin McFarlane's comment in the opening paper, where does time and temporality fit into these stories, narratives, and this research? So I was interested in that notion of stasis within flexibility, and the notion of the constant movement. Then does that then destroy stasis, or is it lurking there in the background? So just very briefly, for the 4 papers, Roger's paper, I'm just going to ask one question each. I tried to think of the Uber question, but it wasn't going to happen, so apologies. In Roger's paper, I was really interested, you're focusing on suburban, and you said there was no essential difference between the suburban and the urban. And when you showed the view from your office, I was thinking, okay, where's the urban, where's the suburban? So I wondered, what is the suburban? Is in Lefebvre's production of space, is there suburban space that's been produced? And if we're talking about is the post-suburban, is that the urban then? That was just that notion of how we would define the suburban in this framework. In Beth's, I was interested in the 3 ways of governance, and I was thinking, are these concurrent? Are they nested forms of governance? But primarily, what's creating the change? Why were these waves of governance happening? What's the driving force? And is there a 4th wave around the corner? I was just interested in the motor that makes these forms of governance appear and disappear. In Igor's city regions, I was interested in the comparative territorial benchmarking, and because implied there's some criteria there. And are those criteria static? How do you benchmark cities, etc.? And also I thought the notion of scale, and there was only one, this is very minor, but you talked about the problematic mountainous regions and how that led to disconnectivity. Well, if you look at the notion of scale, actually mountainous regions can provide very niche, close areas of connectivity. So Lefebvre's work in the Pyrenees was was about those villages in the Pyrenean valleys that were really very highly socially connected. So I was just, interested in the Basque Country, where the scale of your disconnectivity comes into. And finally, for Arwen, I was, again, the notion of basic services. And when you start breaking down the state's provision of electricity, water, etc., when does a basic become a privilege? Because if we're in a nice community with a consensual operating unit, that doesn't then create, it's not a basic service, because it depends on where you live and how active your local neighbourhood is. And I'm guessing in many cases cooperatives work if you have active citizens who might have not enough time, or they might have too much time to get involved. And so there's that sort of element there between your in your talk and that notion of when do we actually lose the notion of a basic service, and classic case of hollowing out the state. I fired through the questions, so I'm really conscious that this is a great 2 days, and I know there'll be lots of other questions following through. So I'll hand it back to Steve and the speakers.
Thank you very much, Alex Schaff from the University of Leeds. This is a great set of papers, and I have questions probably for all of you. But I wanted to focus one to Beth. And I like to think that perhaps your last-minute inclusion on the program is a kind of a subtle recognition from the South that the urban revolution, like the Industrial Revolution, will actually be centered in the North, at least in the UK. But I wanted to, sort of with that in mind in some ways, I wanted to poke you to be a little bit more specific about how you see the university involved, or the transformation of the university in some ways involved in this urban governance transformation, and how central is it? In what way is it centered? I understand the sort of critique and co-optation, but I'm not as clear about the actual sort of lived experience of the university in this transformation.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then ask the panel to those members of the panel to respond accordingly. So the next question's over here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Amelia Melville. Is that going through? Hello? Okay. Okay. I've got a very practical question for Arwen.
Sorry, if you hold the microphone like that and speak directly into the top, it will work.
Okay, so I've got a very practical question about trying to develop a similar thing to what you've been doing in Berlin in the UK, and whether you know about the regulatory kind of framework in the UK, and whether those kinds of contracts are coming up, and have you explored that with people who are active in a similar area?
Thank you. And then the gentleman just in front of you in the striped shirt.
Hello, I'm Matthew Gandy, University College London. I've got a question for Arwen. I understand in Berlin there's been a movement to regain control of water, the Wassertisch, and I wondered whether there'd been a kind of a momentum across different sectors towards, you described taking back the city, and I really found your presentation fascinating, and I just want to know a little bit more about the broader strategic momentum or direction of what's happening in Berlin.
If you pass the mic there, but hold your question a moment. Can we maybe get responses to the first 3 questions?
Yes, so should I also respond to the question that the discussant raised?
Yes.
Yes, so I've got 2 questions. One then is about whether or not these waves of governance are nested or concurrent, and whether or not we might see a 4th wave. Just to reiterate, I guess what I'm saying is that this is a viewpoint on governance. In other words, it's acknowledging that there's ontological and epistemological fluidity, in which case it's not that one wave has been superseded by another, it's that how we see the city, how we think about it, how we study it, and how we engage with it is what's subject to change. But you could then argue that actually the traditions and narratives of the state within these 3 waves do exist concurrently in time. So people act as if the state was real, they act as if the city was bounded, they talk as if meta-governance had some real kind of effect, and they work as if there were only a set of necessities about capitulating to certain forms of market rationale rather than choices. So I don't think that's quite a simple answer about nestedness, but there is a concurrency of traditions and the way in which people mobilise those narratives to justify their positions. In relation to the second very interesting question, thank you, and all hail the North. We have looked at this in some depth, and at the risk of plugging it, in Tim and our book on social research and reflexivity, the last part, we do focus on universities quite extensively. But I would apply the same kind of critique to the university as we've applied all morning to the city and to the state. It's not a homogeneous mass. It's composed of many heterogeneous actors. It has different traditions, beliefs and dilemmas. Parts of the university act as if they were part of the capitalist order, and bolstering a very particular kind of ideology. But what we're arguing is that within that, across different disciplines, across different faculties, across different ways of seeing, knowing and acting, you can find some spaces of discretion. So there is no single answer. I think it's about how your conditions, your cultures of knowledge production permit you to exploit that, and whether or not you adopt a reflexive attitude to think about it in the first place.
Respond to David or the other questions?
I would like to, I'm going to answer the 2 questions. The one was related to benchmarking, and the second one about the scales. About the first one, I think that I confirm my intuition. I will change the comparative territorial connection. I think that we cannot really benchmark, because benchmark implies that you can capture the good practices in a territory, and this is not the point of my research. And about comparing, I think that benchmark comes from the business studies. Comparativeness comes from comparative studies. So why not just calling that connection? We are connecting two different regions. So this is the first answer. And about the second one, I think that I agree that Lefebvre talked about how in some valleys, like in the Pyrenees, the social connectivity could be fostered when it's just in a small scale. But what I'm just talking about is that, and I can give you one example recently, because then the next presentation was about cooperatives. I'm just thinking, when I'm saying that about the past case, is because I'm thinking about the cooperatives and about the Mondragon. Mondragon, recently we had not a really good news about Mondragon, because it was a big company. One of the first cooperative just was bankrupt. So what I'm telling, what I wanted to argue is that in the local level into the valley, the connectivity works really well. The point is that the past case is not good connecting valleys, connecting all the territory. That's the point. How can you understand that we have an airport 20 kilometers far from San Sebastian, and we are not using that in Biarritz, in France? For me, it's terrible. So it's why I wanted to answer you in this.
Yeah, I think these two questions go well together, actually, on the Wassertuch and the sort of the greater development we have on this question of the hollowing out of the state and who can provide sort of basic services or who should provide them, because this question of who provides these kinds of essential services for infrastructure was really our starting point, that we thought this dichotomy of having public control and then reversing that and then having private control, and now obviously that wasn't the solution to all of our problems either. That was the point where we started to think there are certain types of infrastructure that should not be subject only to private profit maximization thoughts, because it's a logic, not because it's bad people in these companies, but because it's a logic that seems to conflict with a lot of the needs that you have and the interests you have in serving these kinds of infrastructures. And on the other hand, a completely public or a sole public actor who provides these services didn't work out, and so that's why we're proposing this idea of a new public-private partnership, or you have a more direct access of citizens. But nevertheless, I personally don't think that that's the last answer to who can and should provide these services either. I think it's work in progress and sort of finding a set of actors on a local level that fits the local needs. And that sort of responds to the question on the Wassertuch. What we're seeing across sectors is this sort of renaissance of communal management, and that was what the Wassertuch was all about, that people had this sort of surprise moment of success with a referendum calling for public control of water services, because the private control of water services had led to an immense increase in prices and very serious deficits in the management. And that's what we're seeing across Germany with water, with energy, also with waste management to a certain extent, that we have sort of a renewal of trust in public management, but at the same time an uncertainty of how to sort of design local structures that can then work. And it's interesting because Berlin and Hamburg, which are the sort of the two major cities in Germany, are facing very similar challenges at the moment. So Hamburg also has a cooperative trying to take back grid operations. Hamburg also had a referendum on public control of the energy grid, which was held with federal elections and which was successful. So what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of sort of pushing back of the large economic actors, but we're not sure yet where we're going with this, because the way forward between public actors and cooperatives is not yet clear. And unfortunately, we get a lot of these questions in the last few weeks, and I know a little about the US because I've focused my research there, but I don't know about the UK. I'm happy to find out and get back to you, and more power to you, obviously, but I don't want to say anything wrong about the regulatory context, so I'm sorry.
Roger. Okay, the question about the suburbs and the two questions actually. Let me answer that first in the easy way. In our project, we have a definition, but not of suburbs, but of suburbanization, suburbanism. So I give you the precise definition, which only solves the problem of definition, which is we call suburbanization the combination of non-central population and economic growth with urban spatial expansion. Now, here it becomes difficult because we also look at shrinking cities. So it's not only urban growth, it's also shrinkage in suburban context. When we talk about suburbanisms in the plural, because we realize that there are very different ways of looking at that, we refer to a growing prevalence of qualitatively distinct suburban ways of life, and that is with clear reference to the Chicago school notion of that is in that tradition. And that is where the problems only begin. So the second part of your question, the second meaning of your question is, why talk about suburban when everything is urban, and why talk about post-suburban? Now, that is a tactical move at this point. And it has, for me, out of the 50 researchers that are part of our project, a lot of people have different ways of dealing with this. And many of our colleagues who work in the so-called Global South use peri-urban, which I don't use in Canada, for example. It doesn't have that same meaning. I like to use post-suburban. I used for years Tom Sievert's Zwischenstadt, in between city, which I think has a lot of, it's very powerful in a variety of ways. But I've now come to use post-suburban, following the lead of Nick Phelps and Fulong Wu, who've really done a lot of thinking around the concept of post-suburban. And the reason why I personally use it is because it gives me an opportunity, first of all, not to create a neologism like the LA School did for 20 years, creating neologisms. At Soja has created 20 new words. But really the city didn't change, but the words changed. And we all use these words now. And we're grateful to Soja for having done this. But in reality, most of those 20 words didn't actually have an explanatory power. So if I now invent a word to describe that new thing, it won't do the trick. But what post-suburban does, it recognizes that we're post that classical understanding of a literature which for 90% of the time uses suburban in that very conventional way of single-family homes in a flat subdivision somewhere in the northern country. And that is what I'm not referring to. What I also like about post-suburban is the fact that it allows me to look at the city as emergent in the gerund form, as cities in waiting, and this is very important, folding in onto itself. And that is really the most important aspect of post-suburbanization, which is different from primary suburbanization and different from classical urbanization. It is the suburban peripheral city folding in upon itself and creating entirely new forms of socio-spatial, socio-economic, socio-cultural, socio-ecological relationships. Back to the question of assemblages, new assemblages of the global, was in my last slide. And that is what post-suburbia is really all about.
Thanks. Now, I'm aware that we're eating into the lunch break, and I'm concerned about a governance crisis of another sort, which is the governance of our appetites, to say nothing of the governance of the food delivery system. So I'm going to take 3 more quick questions, and I'm going to invite the panel, please, to give brief responses to those 3 questions, and then we'll go for lunch. Oh, okay, we were answered. Are there 3 more brave souls who would...
My question is for Igor. I've been very impressed by the ambitious redefinition of a city region, and I would like to ask you about this this apparently registered name CR5 system framework. Because I have found it a little surprising that the 5 components of this framework you are developing, according to the diagram you've shown, they don't relate to each other. They are just apparently relating on a one-on-one relation to the so-called demos I have seen.
Sorry,
I
ask to keep the question short. So I'll ask you, Igor, to address the justification between the relationship.
I think that.
So, are there two other questions? Another one.
Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Davide Poncini, Polytechnic of Milan. I would like to ask to Beth, just to have some more elements on the theoretical background of reflectiveness, because the reflective practitioner, Donald Schoen's work, refers generally to design-oriented kind of practices. And I'm really interested also to understand how we can conceive it in a richer way with process-oriented kind of practices as the planning and governance management kinds of topics you work with. So just a bit more of theoretical background.
Thank you. And one last opportunity. Going, gone. Okay, Igor and then Beth.
Just briefly, I think that the framework is, I mentioned, systemic framework. Of course, the four systems are related systemically, are interdependent. I'm using Gregory Bateson cybernetics in order to just support this idea. And the demos is just a sum of the four systems, but they are, of course, they are related. I mean, I'm just analyzing one by one, but inside of each system, I didn't have time enough in order to explain and present that, but I was using three factors. So the three factors are related. Cyber is not just disconnected with police and with Civitas. Any case is different. I'm working like that.
It's such a huge question prior to lunch. The enormity of it just makes me think maybe we should have a conversation. I mean, obviously there's theories about the way in which the whole of society is being characterised as a risk society. We're being more individualised. You can read things like Ulrich Beck and things like that, people who talk about reflexive governance. I mean, in our book we do start to outline, the first part's written by Tim, some of these dimensions around the positions that people hold, the dispositions that they have, their feelings of belonging to particular epistemic cultures and various other things. So, I mean, let's pick it up after lunch. It's such a big question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to you for your attention and your questions.